My name is Jordyn Smith, and I am the voice and the astrologer for this YouTube channel, Nonconformist Conscience. This is the second in the series for understanding the archetypes within astrology. And today I am going to go over Taurus, the second house, and Venus as an archetype. Just to recap, whenever we are utilizing evolutionary astrology, which is what I practice and teach. It's my foundation. When we're looking at the archetype, we are looking at the house, the natural zodiac ruler, and the natural planetary ruler of that. And it is all one archetype. And again, that will help you to be able to synthesize. And of course, I'm going to be showing you a chart as an example of this. And what I will do is I will just go over the foundations of the Pluto paradigm, and then I will only pull in the second house Venus dynamics corresponding to this. That way you guys can see how you can utilize this to synthesize. So let's talk about the archetype of the second house, Taurus and Venus. I'm going to keep this simple, just so you all who are wanting to understand this we don't get in the weeds. Of course, there's a lot more to the Venus archetype. Because Venus, what I will say is Venus is the ruler of Libra and Taurus, and Venus has a higher octave, which is Neptune. And I'm not really going to get into that today because I want to keep it to the second house in Taurus and Venus. But a notable mention is that that is a natural yod held within the natural zodiac between Taurus second house, Libra seventh house, and Pisces 12th house. And what that is really speaking to is this function of Venus, and how on the one hand, through Libra seventh house, that's our relationships with others. Taurus second house is our relationship to ourselves. So it's yin energy, whereas seventh house is yang energy. And I will totally get to that whenever I get to the seventh house as an archetype. But through this dynamic, Neptune being the higher octave of Venus is really about transcending our own inner limitations and how we relate to ourselves. And whenever we actualize the higher octave of Neptune through Venus, it's where we are really tapping into a different way of how we inwardly relate to ourselves. And that the inwardly relating to ourselves is the second house Taurus function and the inner side of Venus through the second house in Taurus. Again, I'll elaborate on this as we go through the other houses when we get to the seventh house and when we get to the 12th house. But again, want to keep it simple. So archetypally, the second house, Taurus and Venus, through that inner expression, yin energy moving in. It is very much looking at our inner relationship to self. It's also looking at how we survive. And how we survive is through understanding what we need and what we value. And that is why through Taurus and the second house and Venus being pulled into this, it corresponds with our personal needs and values. And as we evolve, we end up transforming our values throughout different lifetimes. They go from temporal values to more spiritual values. And whenever we're accessing spiritual values, that's where we're starting to tap into that higher octave of Venus through Neptune, Pisces. But the second house, Taurus, Venus, in this expression, it's about how one can be self-reliant and self-sufficient in a multitude of ways. And one of those is through survival. Um, and how we survive is by knowing what we need and what we value, and then utilizing our resources in order to survive. And so resources are a archetype of the second house in Taurus. And in a natal chart, you can see where someone has specific types of inner resources that they have acquired through prior life efforts. And that is seen by what is on the house cusp, its ruler, Venus, and where Taurus is in the chart. Um, and so this can really be in the second house, tapping into these inner resources through prior life efforts. This can be inner knowledge. It can be understanding that more timeless universal values are an inner resource because we're able to access that instead of living in a more temporal way of living. A lot of times whenever you see an emphasis on the second house or Taurus dynamics, that is where someone could have experienced or is experiencing in this lifetime survival issues. How do I live? How do I survive? And there can be trials and tribulations for that person, understanding how to become self-reliant. It's also where through the sextile from the second house to the fourth house, we can learn how to become emotionally self-reliant, meaning that we're not depending on others to meet our needs. It's also why the second house in Taurus, through the internalized function of Venus, corresponds to not only our inner relationship to self, but also our self-esteem and our self-worth. Oftentimes, if someone has a heavy emphasis, depending on their chart with Taurus second house Venusian dynamics, that can be someone who is working on their self-esteem and self-worth for a multitude of reasons. This is also in the second house dealing with Venus. It is all types of values and needs, but you're looking at what your relational needs are. Venus is relational. It's your inner relationship to self through Taurus, and it is relationships with others through the sign of Libra in the seventh house. But whenever we understand what it is that we need in a relationship and what we value, the key through Taurus in the second house is to be able to give that to ourselves in order to be self-reliant. This is where you also learn about your sexual values. Again, it goes back to this is a archetype of survival. In order for humans to survive, the species to survive and keep going, keep living, we have to procreate. And so if we are tapping into temporal values within our sexuality, there can be some self-worth, self-esteem dynamics that come up. If we are more tapped into the natural, more spiritual, timeless values, that's where we can really understand our sexual values and needs in a spiritual way. And to be able to fortify that from within ourselves by tapping into spirit and source, spirit and or source, goddess, however you want to call it. The other dynamic with Taurus second house Venus, if we're looking at this through the lens of a more transpersonal lens, we're looking at the innate resources that Earth has. Taurus correlates to land and the resources from the land. It's also correlating to Earth, Gaia, the land, and the resources held within it. some dynamics that can come up through this archetype is if there has been trauma to one's self esteem and self-worth, seen through Aquarius 11th house square to the second house. There can be a dynamic of needing to recover one's self-worth and self-esteem through understanding one's unique individuality that helps them to understand what their personal values and needs are. The other dynamic with trauma correlating to the inner relationship to self is that Taurus, second house, and Venus through this inner expression can correspond to inertia. A lot of people that I've seen in my practice, and I even have a kiddo who has this, is where they're carrying a lot of prior life content on a subconscious level, and they're wanting to work on self-esteem and self-worth issues, their values, their needs, but there can be a hard time with what it is that they're feeling. Taurus, second house corresponds with sense, anything of the senses, touch, smell, taste, hearing, sight, the senses, anything that's a sensory perception. And when one could be coming in with a lot of trauma regarding their personal relationship to self, and you're, asking them, how are you feeling? Oftentimes they feel very overwhelmed. They're feeling so many different sensations at once that it's hard for them to tap into the emotional content that is tethered to those sensations. And so it's why Taurus is also corresponding with grounding, the need to ground within oneself in order to tap into what those senses are correlating with. So sometimes people can have a lot of inertia. This can also be, this is fixed energy. This can be where someone absolutely resists the need to be self-reliant, to be self-sufficient, resist working on their how to become secure within in order to be self-reliant, to have healthy self-worth and self-esteem. And there can be a propensity for sometimes not only a resistance to this, and it's out of fear for many, many different reasons, too long to go into. The more and more you do chart interpretation and just understanding this, the more that it will open up this archetype for you yourself. But a lot of times with someone who has like a stacked second house or a lot of Taurus dynamics, they can be someone who can be really stubborn and doesn't want to grow. Taurus can be a bit lazy. It gets really comfortable. It's why it also corresponds to being a hermit or hermiting. You also see sometimes within this archetype with different mitigating factors, but part of this archetype can be agoraphobia, not wanting to leave the house, fear of leaving the house because it's inducing fear of being able to survive, or through the Earth trying to Virgo and Capricorn, it can be where, there's a lot of fear around persecution and judgment through society. Or it can be about germs. There's all different ways that this can correspond, and that's really pulling in this polarity of the eighth house. But as an archetype, it can correspond to agoraphobia, hermiting, stubbornness. It can also correspond to someone who is really working on who they are and recovering what is authentic and natural for them on a individualistic level in order to fortify that inner relationship to self, in order to understand what it is that they need and they value to be able to be self-sufficient and self-reliant. I want to see if there's something else I want to speak about in regard to this archetype. This is also where people can have issues with overeating, not eating enough. There's different dynamics where you can see in the chart sometimes that survival around starvation, someone died of starvation in a prior lifetime, if they have kind of an emphasis on this, and possibly with Virgo or a few different things, but that it also reflects through survival, different dynamics of where one can have experienced starvation. It's also where we see some people who overeat because it feels good. Taurus is everything that feels good on a sensory level. And so there can be, through the sextile to Pisces and Taurus, there can be escapism or addiction issues around food, or even sometimes with, drugs and alcohol, if the Neptune Pisces is really indicative with a strong Taurus second house Venus emphasis. And oftentimes that can also be because they aren't wanting to deal with their personal relationship to self. They're wanting to escape themselves. And so you can see that come up again: self-worth, self-esteem, survival. So I just want you to get a feel of how these archetypes can really expand out, especially when you start correlating them to different types of archetypes. It's always interesting to correlate a certain sign and house to what it is naturally aspecting in the zodiac. Like, there's also a yod between Libra, Taurus, and Sagittarius. This can be sometimes where someone is needing to work on their self-worth through not abandoning themselves and through improving upon their authenticity and being honest, Sag. And um, really wanting to understand what feels authentic for them in order to nurture that inner relationship. I often see a Saggy dynamic with Taurus too, with people who are multicultural or indigenous. Um, Culture is speaking to Sag, and if you put some Capricorn in there, that's correlating to, skin. And so you're looking at how these dynamics have impacted their inner relationship to self in a positive or negative way. Anything can be 100% positive or it can be 100% negative. So there's lots of ways to look at this. Oftentimes, people who have a strong Taurus function in their chart, especially women, you'll see, especially if there's a dynamic with Leo and Aquarius going on, amongst other things, there can be this dynamic of where they're needing to have extreme self-focus in order to reintegrate their own inner relationship to self. And there could have been, if they're a woman and not wanting to have kids and choose not to have kids, you often see this with a strong Taurus emphasis, of where they will end up choosing not to have kids because they're wanting to focus on that inner relationship to self. And there is a reason for that from a karmic and evolutionary necessity perspective. Sometimes I see this with women who have lost their life, didn't survive Taurus because they were having too many kids because there wasn't birth control or forms of birth control in prior lifetimes. So there's all types of survival issues that come up. Also, in a more distorted view, I see this with sometimes people who end up having sexual addictions, especially if there's like a heavy emphasis on Scorpio as well, and Neptune Pisces. And it's oftentimes because they are getting their self-worth from those addictions, and it's a way to escape. And it's also because there's a strong sexual quality to Taurus. Taurus also through Venus is corresponding to what you attract. If you have not actualized being self-reliant, well, you're going to attract people who are not self-reliant. And Taurus can correspond with entrapping as well, because you're the survival mode. I don't know how to survive on my own. So entrapping people in order to help you survive instead of doing it for yourself. And that can be seen a lot of different ways. But as someone changes the way in which they inwardly relate to themselves, they will no longer attract that. They will then attract someone who is just as self-reliant as them, and the relationship then becomes, I'm here because I want to be here, not because I need to be here. You'll attract like-minded individuals whose values correspond with your values that you've come to find out about yourself. Taurus is also correlating with, same with Venus, whereas Mercury is about the anatomy of hearing, the psychology of hearing is Venus. And it is through the Taurus expression that it is the ability to listen to oneself from within. You can't survive and be totally self-sufficient and self-reliant if you are not able to listen to yourself. And so oftentimes if someone is needing to work on Taurus second house dynamics and there's an emphasis, this is where they could be recovering the ability to listen to themselves from within. They might have had a lot of lifetimes of listening to others, and that is Libra. So they're needing to throw off the voices of others in order to reconnect with their inner voice, in order to then heal self-esteem. Being able to listen to yourself and what it is that you need and you value and what you need to do really helps to strengthen your inner relationship to self and helps to heal self-esteem issues. I don't think I've ever come across someone who has healthy self-esteem that doesn't listen to themselves. They have an ability to listen to themselves and know what is right for them and align it with their values and their needs. So yeah, I think this is really covering this archetype so far. So let's give a chart example. So today, the chart example that I'm going to use is Gloria Steinem's, and I'm going to give some background info on her. If you want to know where I got the information, I will have links in the description. I am going to link a Netflix documentary, or it's a docuseries that I watched where I got some of this information from as well. If you're wanting to check it out, to know more about her, to follow along, or to come back to this video, it will be linked in the description. So let me tell you a little bit about Gloria. So she was born in Toledo, Ohio, and her paternal grandmother was from Poland and Jewish, so her father is Polish and Jewish, and her grandmother was active in the women's suffrage movement. She founded a girls' school in Toledo, and her grandmother also was able to rescue many family members from the Holocaust. Her mother had her whenever she was 34 years old. And um, it was said that her mom was like really happy and jovial. Um, and then her mom had a nervous breakdown and would have uh, perpetual psychosis and episodes where she was like hallucinating. And because of this, her mom could not keep a job. And eventually her father left because it was too hard for him to deal with. And this happened whenever she was 10 years old. Because her mom couldn't keep a job, and then her father left when she was 10, this affected them financially in a very severe way. And Gloria started to try to figure out how to make money for the family. Um, she also wasn't really able to go to school that often. She would go for a little bit, and then um, they would move around because her and her mom stayed in a travel trailer, and then they would, move to a different state or to a different city. And it wasn't until she was 12 that she was able to attend a full semester of school. And like I said, she took on the financial responsibilities and the care for her mom. Um, at one point, she took her mom to the hospital because she was like really scared. And the doctor told her that her mom needed to be committed full time. And because Gloria had read an article in Time magazine about um, women who are institutionalized, she knew that that was not good for her mom, that it would actually, it could perpetuate abuse and different dynamics. And so she said that um, through seeing what happened to her mom, and the doctors being really apathetic towards her, she learned a lot about social injustices, especially around women being discriminated against, ableism, and also unequal job opportunities. So it was really where she became aware that women lack social and political equality. Once she ended up um, graduating high school, she then went to Smith College and was able to graduate. At this point in time, once she was graduating, she was in a relationship and she got engaged, and she knew that it was just not going to work out. And so she moved to England, and this was right before she went to continue her education in India. And so at the age of 22 in 1957, Gloria had an abortion, and this procedure was performed by a doctor. He was a British physician, and this was in the time period when abortion was still illegal. It wasn't until 10 years later that abortions were legalized in England. Years later, she wrote a memoir called My Life on the Road, and she dedicated this memoir to him. And she said in that memoir, she said Dr. John Sharp of London, who in 1957, a decade before physicians in England could legally perform an abortion for any reason other than the health of the woman, took the considerable risk of referring for an abortion a 22-year-old American on her way to India, knowing only that she had broken an engagement at home to seek an unknown fate. And he said to her, "You must promise me two things. First, you will not tell anyone my name. And second, you will do what you want to do with your life." And Gloria is said that this had a very profound effect on her. And this comes into her work later on as well. So she eventually moved back, and she moved to New York City. And in 1963, while working on an article for Huntington Hartford's Show magazine, Steinem needed to make extra money. And so she was employed as a Playboy bunny at the New York Playboy Club. And she ended up publishing an article in 1963 called A Bunny's Tale. And it featured a photo of Steinem and the dressed up as a bunny, as a Playboy bunny. And in that article, it detailed how women were treated in these clubs. She was exposing this. And whenever this came out, it was really hard for her to be able to write articles for a while because, in my opinion, this is the irony of the situation. She's exposing this, talking about these different dynamics dealing with women, and no one would hire her to write for them because they viewed her only as a bunny. And Steinem maintained that she was really proud of the work that she did for that article, on that article. And it was because of, in that article, she was publicizing the exploitive working conditions of how the bunnies, and especially um, the sexual demands that they were having to experience, which was actually a lot of it was against the law. And she felt proud. And she said, you know, even though she wasn't able to get work for a while because that's how she was viewed as a bunny. She said it didn't really matter to her because there was an upside to this. Because of her exposing these dynamics, it cultivated a change. Because the owner of Playboy, Hugh Hefner, he read this article and it prompted him to review and improve the working conditions for these women. And then in 1969, she covered an abortion speak out for New York Magazine. And this was held in a church basement in Village, New York. And Steinman, because she had had an abortion herself in London at the age of 22, she felt what she called a really big aha moment at the speak out. And she went on to say that um, this was the beginning in her life as an active feminist. She didn't feel like she was a feminist until that day. And later on, through her being a journalist and, you know, being outspoken, she went on to found Miss, which is a feminist magazine, and she had an ongoing column in the New York Times. She also went to speak to in front of Congress and in the National Women's Convention. And she also ended up at one point, um, what was it? At one point, she uh, was speaking at the South African embassy with other Congress members about South Africa's apartheid, excuse me, and she was arrested. And then and that's what she was ousted for. The other notable mentions are, you know, she was very outspoken about how she felt like women who were married were actually sexually enslaved to men and that they were subject to servitude, to taking care of kids and, you know, providing free care and free work within the home, and how she was not going to get married. She ended up later in life getting married in the year of 2000 to a man, and he ended up passing of cancer in 2004. And she still continues doing work to this day of being a feminist, speaking up even now for more things around civil rights for people of color. And you know, there's been some dynamics where she's had to change her beliefs and her values, and that is part of her evolutionary path. And so it's worth mentioning, you know, all of this to set the scene for me going over this chart. Before I share the chart, something that I forgot to mention in the first episode of this series of going over the archetypes is I didn't speak about the stage of evolution that Lady Gaga was in. And it's really important for us to understand when we're reading a chart, no matter how we're doing this, through the lens of evolutionary astrology, to really understand the context. It's not one size fits all. And it's important to know someone's stage of evolution. Luckily, Lady Gaga and um, Gloria Steinem are in the same stage of evolution, which is the third stage of individuation. So just to brief you on that before I share this chart, third stage individuation souls are going to have something that they are meant to share that is progressive in nature with the collective. And it has the ability to help the collective evolve, especially the consensus. Um, it's usually very progressive in nature. It can be avant-garde. And if you think about Lady Gaga in the first episode, her music and the way she was able to really be an ally of the LGBTQ plus community really speaks to that, and also her philanthropic work. And this is something that, Gloria Steinem has in common with her. She's just doing it in a different way. So let me share her chart and let's go over this real quick. Remember, I'm just going to keep to the Pluto paradigm, and then also then just pull in the second house where Taurus is at and Venus in the second house rulers, so I don't inundate everyone with too much information. So this is a soul who has Pluto in Cancer retrograde in the ninth house. And Pluto in Cancer generation were really at the forefront of dealing with confronting gender roles through social structures, and they were planting those seeds. So she has Pluto in Cancer retrograde in the ninth house, and what you can see is that this is a soul who has, and through in her prior lifetimes, has been confronting Pluto and getting to the bottom of beliefs, especially dealing with social gender roles, Cancer. And Pluto is retrograde. And so there's this need for her to relive and re-experience key dynamics, especially dealing with women or women's issues, as reflected in what I went over in her biography, where she's meant to resolve this. Pluto in the ninth house is also someone who has been getting to the bottom of not just beliefs, but also what constitutes truths. And in this stage of evolution can really have the ability to tap into natural law, which is a Sagittarian and ninth house function. And it's where someone can also, they have been expanding their consciousness through understanding different philosophies. And for her, this has been about how she's inwardly nurtured herself on an emotional level. That's seen with the moon there. And also how she is still needing to throw off some old type of belief structures as well. The work isn't done. She's still evolving, right? And this moon, this Pluto is ruled by the moon in Leo, and that speaks to, what the egoic structure is in this present life. But if you're looking at how she was able to actualize her Pluto in a prior lifetime, it was through the South Node in Leo in the ninth house, and it's ruled by the Sun in Aries in the fifth. This is a soul, and by the way, I do want to say that these nodes are stationed, so there's a massive emphasis on her needing to integrate the past and the present in order to continue to move into that north node, not throwing off the past wholesale, but through integrating it. So how is she doing her Pluto work? Pluto in Cancer in the ninth house. Well, her South Node is in Leo, stationed in the ninth house. And prior lifetimes, her egoic structure was around learning the truths and remembering that Cancer conditions this. She was learning how to self-actualize through understanding what emotionally nurtured her, through understanding what her personal truths were. And she was utilizing her sun in Aries to act on her desires to self-actualize her own freedom, independence, and autonomy, Aries. Um, and so as she was, having freedom, independence, and autonomy, it was helping her to get to the bottom of the difference between a belief and a truth as a way to emotionally nurture herself. And in this lifetime, her moon is applying to the South Node. It is the ruler of her ninth house. It is the ruler of her Pluto. And it's also in Leo in the ninth house. And it is also ruled by this sun. That's in a new phase conjunction to Mars. So for her in this lifetime, there has been a need to continue to do the work that she was doing in a prior lifetime of understanding and nurturing herself from within through Leonian self-love and through creativity. And that creativity came through her understanding truths, especially around women's issues, Cancer. And, it's ruled by the sun, and it's also speaking to, in this lifetime, her egoic structure is one that's absolutely needed Leonian self-focus in order for her to act on her desires, meaning she needed the freedom and independence. If you go back and you think about how she decided to get an abortion, which there are signatures for that in this chart, that abortion was a catalyst for her to understand that it was a woman's choice. Mars correlates to choice making. Remember, I talked about this the last episode we did on Aries, Mars, and the first house. And so she was really needing to have this Leo self-focus and give herself permission to have freedom and independence in order to actualize and do what she came here to do. What is her ongoing egoic structure that's helping her to pull in her Pluto polarity point, which is, Capricorn in the third house. While her North Node is speaking to this, and her North Node is in Aquarius in the third, and it is ruled by Uranus and Aries in the sixth house. This is someone who is meant to share the knowledge, third house, that she has gained through her own prior life efforts. And that is not only seen with the moon applying to the South Node, both the South Node and the moon being ruled by this Mars, but it's also seen with Venus in a new phase conjunction to the North Node. This is where what she's learned, her Taurus inner resources, are now meant to be given to the collective. It's meant to be shared. And how is she doing that? She's doing that through writing. She was a journalist. That is the third house, is about writing. How else is she doing it? It's through activism, Aquarius. And the North Node and Venus are also ruled by this Uranus and Aries in the sixth house. You can see that this is a soul who not only is wanting to help the collective, Aquarius, Uranus, she's wanting to be of service, sixth house. And as she does that, that helps her to continue to improve upon her own inner relationship to self and to relate to herself in a different way. It's helping her to nurture herself from within. Again, to relate to herself in a very different way, to apply all of the things that she's been learning through individuation, Aquarius, Uranus, and to now utilize that as an inner resource to be of service to others. This is also, I will say, this need for her, Uranus is sextile her Saturn, which is conjunct her Venus and her North Node. A lot of this is really about her, as she's being of service, it's helping her to liberate from her anger that she's felt within injustices within social systems, and also towards men. Remembering that she talked about how men, she viewed marriage as, women being sexually enslaved to men and being subservient and having to do free work, and not being viewed as an equal. This is, you can see this dynamic going on in her chart with Uranus sextile that Saturn. It's also speaking to her, she's wanting to be her authority. So then we need to look at Sagittarius on the second house cusp. It is ruled by Jupiter in the 12th house and Libra retrograde. Sagittarius on the second house cusp is going to correlate with how she inwardly relates to herself. Well, she's inwardly relating to herself through understanding her own personal truths and aligning her values with that. And what are her values? Well, her values are rooted in these natural, timeless laws, Jupiter in the 12th house, that are rooted in equality and giving, sharing, and inclusion. It's that Jupiter's retrograde. She's had to relive these instances of not being included, of experiencing social injustices, especially through the judicial system, which is a 9th house Jupiter Sag dynamic. And she's recovering. What she's recovering with Jupiter retrograde is her ability to know that she is an equal to men. And how is she doing that? Well, Jupiter is trining its ruler Venus, which is conjunct the North Node. It's through expressing herself and her authenticity, Jupiter, and her individuality, Aquarius. And what are her inner resources that are seen with Sag on that second house cusp? Well, it's her ability to be steadfast and to get a higher education, Jupiter, 9th house dynamics going on, as a way to survive, and to utilize natural laws around women's issues as a way to be self-sufficient and self-reliant. This is also, again, it's how she's relating to herself. She knows that women are equal. And then this is restated by Taurus being on the 7th house cusp, ruled by that Venus. She's been entering the social sphere with her individuality intact, and has the ability to speak. It's ruled by Venus in the 3rd house. She's been able to express herself and expressed the values, Venus, that she has that are rooted in inclusivity, Aquarius, being an equal, and really being able to relate to herself in that way. She's also, with that Taurus on the 7th house cusp, she is, you can see her values are rooted in equality and justice, and that she is a powerhouse for women. A couple of notable mentions that I will say is that her Pluto is square her Uranus, and it's square her Jupiter. Her Pluto, the square that it's in to this Uranus, is really speaking to where she's needing to act on her personal truths to be of service, and how when she does that in a true Uranian Aquarius way, that she is able, her work is taking on a life of its own, which is a very Aquarius dynamic. And her Pluto Jupiter square is really speaking to this need to act on applying her personal truths to help with social justice, especially dealing with women. Um, so it's just restated over and over and over again in her chart how she is um, utilizing her inner resources from prior life efforts. Um, Notable mention, because they are in Taurus, Ceres is conjunct Cassandra, both at 7 degrees in Taurus in the 6th house, and they are sextile Mercury and Pisces in her 4th house. Ceres is where we can lose something and then we're needing to recover it through nurturing ourselves. Cassandra is where we're needing to recover our inner voice, our inner knowledge, our personal truths as a way to fortify our inner relationship to self. Oftentimes with Cassandra, a Cassandra complex, this can be where someone has been persecuted or scapegoated in prior lifetimes for speaking up about a truth, not what they think is a truth, but what is an actual truth. And the reason why they are persecuted is because it's challenging other people's beliefs. And so with Cassandra and Ceres conjunct and sextile Mercury and Pisces in the 4th house, you can see that in a prior lifetime, there was a loss of her self-confidence and self-worth, dealing from guilt and shame that she carried that affected her inner relationship to self. And through that loss, it was a very disillusioning situation where in this lifetime with Cassandra conjunct that Ceres, what she's doing is she's recovering this Cassandra complex. Her ability to speak up, speak out, especially about for those who have been persecuted or are the underdogs, 6th house, and how she's being of service and she's speaking that truth. It's also where she, through that sextile to Mercury and Pisces in the 4th house, she's nurturing herself on an emotional level through tapping into timeless principles and speaking about them, especially dealing with women's issues. Mercury in the 4th. And you can tell with Venus ruling her Ceres and her Cassandra on that North Node that she's been recovering this. And now she's meant to apply this in this lifetime as a way to give it away. Taurus on the 7th house cusp to share it with others. And through doing so, she's being of service. So it begs the question, what happened to her in a prior lifetime? Where does the anger come from with men? How does that feed into this? And so I will let you all ponder upon this in a very saggy way and allow it to come into your own intuition. And you can, rewind and go look at the chart some more if you wanted to. So yeah, there's a lot of relive experiences in order for her to recover and to culminate these long-standing dynamics and for her to be an activist for women's rights and to help with social justice. Last thing I really want to go over is transiting planets through the 2nd house. Again, this is going to be really generalized because I don't know what sign is in your 2nd house, or the aspects that whatever planet is making to the rest of your chart. So take this for what it is. It is very, very generalized. So Mercury through the 2nd house through a transit, can really be where, on one hand, you could be recovering some type of knowledge, depending on the aspects. It could be where all of a sudden you're understanding that there might be some latent ability from a prior life effort. This can be seen when Venus is transiting through that 2nd house as well, but Mercury can also be where you're wanting to learn more about yourself and what it is that you sense and that you feel, and you're wanting to learn and take in more information through communicating with others about your values, about your needs, to understand what your individuality really is. It's where um, you might be needing to look at if your security is lying within what it is that you think. This can be a time period where you're also needing to communicate what you're feeling to others or to yourself. Um, it is a time, essentially to learn more, to take in more information, to be curious, Mercury, about how you relate to yourself. And then when Venus is transiting the second house, this can be a time where you're wanting to tap into your values, wanting to tap into your needs, wanting to look at um, how your values correspond with others' values. It could be comparing and contrasting, depending on the sign that Venus is in, transiting your second house. This can also be where you're needing to um, really tap into listening to yourself with Venus transiting through the second house. There could be something on a soul level that gets ignited into your consciousness through your own inner listening. But ultimately, it is this time to really tap into how you are inwardly relating to yourself and the values and the needs. It can also induce a time where you're needing to be really self-reliant. And it can be where you're understanding whether or not you have temporal values or more transcendent, natural, timeless values. And then with Mars going through the second house, this is where you could be initiating all types of new desires that are emanating through your own inner listening. It's where you could be wanting to act on making choices around how you inwardly relate to yourself. It can be where a lot of anger could be coming up through how you're feeling and you're needing to get in touch with it. It can also be where you're looking at the patterns of how you inwardly relate to yourself. And um, it can also be a time where you're really a lot of different types of desires around your sexuality could be coming up, and you're really having to ground into yourself to understand what it is and what choice you're needing to make revolving around those. The second house with Mars going through there can be, you know, a time where um, you're wanting to initiate a brand new cycle of how you're relating to yourself and needing to look at those patterns. And then with Jupiter moving through the second house, this can where it can magnify different feelings on a sensory level. It can also be where you're wanting to expand um, upon knowledge from within yourself. It can also be where you are wanting to understand your personal truths or get in touch with the difference between a belief or a truth. And it can also be a time period where you're really needing to tap into your own authenticity. It can also be a time that you can understand whether or not you've been overcompensating for something because you could be having a lot of self-worth issues. And so it can magnify that in order for you to understand that there's more to this dynamic to be gleaned. Um, it's also a time where you could understand or find a philosophical cosmological system that is aligning with your authenticity and what it is that you're valuing, and it can help you to expand upon what you're needing. And then Saturn during going through the second house can be a time where you're really called to utilize those inner resources, to be your own authority, to look at the ways in which you've structured your values, your and your needs. It can also be a time where you could be wanting to take your own inner knowledge and inner resources and apply it to a career as a way to restructure your life. This can also be a time where you could have a lot of survival dynamics come up, especially if you've been suppressing anything. Saturn can induce depression, especially through the second house, and there's a need and a call for one to reflect on what's going on a feeling level to understand what emotions might be tied to them. And this can also be where you're looking at or starting to realize all different types of conditioning, things that have been learned from your family system or your authority figures. And so you're needing to really understand how to be your own authority. Uranus through the second house can be where things can change in an instant. It's where you're trying to absolutely transform your inner relationship to self through objectifying values, needs, everything that's been conditioned. And if you've over-identified with anything in order to liberate from it, it's where you can really observe your feelings in order to tap into your emotions to see if you've over-identified with any type of past trauma that's affecting your self-esteem and the need to liberate from those dynamics in order to transform the way that you inwardly relate to yourself. Neptune through the second house can be a time of where you're really called to tap into the higher octave of Venus in order to transcend your own inner dynamics within the way in which you relate to yourself. And the higher calling is to tap into timeless truths and principles as a way to dissolve old temporal values in order to possibly feel more connected on a spiritual level. This is also a time where you could have disillusioning experiences whenever it comes to money or survival. And so what that's doing is it's teaching you about not giving ultimate meaning outside of yourself, but finding it within yourself and fostering a spiritual relationship in order to culminate long-standing dynamics around self-esteem and idealistic expectations and idealistic values that could actually be distortions of natural law. So it's wanting one to really dissolve temporal types of values and needs. It's also a time where one could have fear around feeling crazy or losing themselves, and there's a higher calling to ground. Second house is about grounding, and so it's truly about grounding and listening to your inner voice to connect with source. That's another way that this could be expressed. And then Pluto in the second house is where you are confronting the ways in which you relate to yourself at a soul level. So it will confront you with survival, self-esteem, self-worth, values, needs. It can also be where you could, because it's a fixed house with a planet that is ruled naturally by a fixed sign, it could be where you are being confronted with where you've absolutely resisted feeling what it is you need to feel on an emotional and psychological level. And it's also confronting you with emotional and psychological dynamics on a soul level that relate to how you inwardly relate and how you're structuring your inner relationship to self. And it's asking for a metamorphosis. It can also be where you're confronting different dynamics around your sexuality and your sexual values in order to metamorphose them. And it's really a time where you could end up, if you consciously work with it, coming out as a completely different person, because it's wanting you to evolve. Pluto, evolution, growth. It's wanting you to evolve your inner relationship to self and how you inwardly relate. So I hope that this helps you to understand what some of these planets can look like, transiting the second house. I will say a notable mention, if you have the sun transiting The second house, this can really be where you're needing to creatively self-actualize through the strength of your own will and ground within your heart center, and to understand how being dignified can be connected to your self-worth. And it can also be where you can um, creatively actualize through transforming that inner relationship to self, depending on the sign of that sun moving through that second house. It's also where you could be asked to look at if you have been being too selfish. And it can really shine a light on these dynamics. And it can also teach these lessons of um, learning that we're all equal and we're all as important or unimportant as the next person. We're all just as special as each other. And so it can also be where if you're tapping into the heart and the joy of who you are, you could really want to be sharing that with other people as a way to self-actualize. So I hope that this video has helped you all. I can't wait to do the next installment. It will be uploaded next week. We will be diving into the archetype of, um, Gemini, Mercury, and the third house, and how what that archetype is. And I will give another chart example and go through the planetary transits of the third house. So um, I hope you all have a beautiful week, and I will see you next week to go over Gemini, the third house, and Mercury.